I sat in the auditorium of Rhinebeck's old college hall, surrounded by the hum of proud families and the rustle of graduation gowns. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, but my eyes never left my son. Michael stood at the front of the stage, his name announced with thunderous applause, a crimson honors sash draped across his shoulders. He looked taller, more certain of himself than ever before, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. My boy, the child I had carried through so much fear and silence, was now a man the world could not ignore. The dean shook his hand and handed him the diploma, a rolled piece of parchment tied with ribbon. But to me, it looked like a scepter. Michael had been one of the best in his class. No one else had maintained such flawless marks. Professors whispered about his future. Companies had already begun circling, and even overseas institutions had made discreet offers. Edinburgh, Scotland, a program in genetic engineering that could launch him straight into the front lines of discovery. The future stretched wide for him, and as the audience rose to their feet, I clapped until my palms stung. But beneath the pride was a heaviness I could not shake. My smile stayed fixed, but inside my chest ached with the knowledge of what lay ahead. In less than a week, I would no longer be Mrs. Whitaker. 20 years of marriage to Thomas would be dissolved in a courthouse, signed away with ink on paper as if it hadn't consumed decades of my life. The irony was cruel. On the same week my son's life was beginning, mine was breaking apart. Thomas sat several rows behind me, stiff in his suit, arms crossed, his expression more of obligation than joy. He had never clapped as hard for Michael as I did. He had never looked at him with the tenderness I carried every day. To Thomas, Michael was not and never had been his son. He had tolerated him, coexisted with him, but acceptance had never come. I could feel his distance like a draft across my back even now, as though the gulf between us had widened into something impossible to cross. And yet, for 20 years, I had tried to build a bridge. I had convinced myself that if I worked harder, loved more fiercely, kept the house in order, kept our lives stitched together, Thomas might one day soften. But men like Thomas didn't change. His silences grew heavier, his absences longer, and eventually I learned the truth. Another family, another child, a secret life running parallel to ours. I should have been angry as I sat there, but instead there was only exhaustion, the kind of tired that seeps into your bones and whispers that it's time to stop fighting battles that cannot be won. I focused on Michael, my anchor, my one undeniable triumph. I had raised him into a man of brilliance and compassion, even if his stepfather refused to see it. When the ceremony ended, people spilled into the courtyard outside, sunlight striking the red brick buildings, cameras flashing as families clustered for photographs. Michael came bounding toward me, diploma still in hand, cheeks flushed with joy. He wrapped his arms around me, and I held him so tightly I thought I might never let go. In that embrace, I found the strength to smile through the storm. But as I looked past his shoulder, I caught Thomas watching, his face unreadable, already detached from us. It was in that moment I understood. This chapter of my life was ending. A door was closing, but perhaps, just perhaps, another was waiting to be opened. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to walk through it. On nights like this, when silence pressed against me after the noise of celebration, memories of my past would return uninvited. I could still see him, as vividly as if he stood before me now, Daniel Brooks. My first love, my only love in many ways. He wasn't polished like the men I would meet later in life. He was fire and recklessness, laughter that rang through alleys, and a stubborn loyalty that drew me in long before I knew how dangerous it could be. I had been a naive girl, the kind who obeyed her parents, studied hard, and never thought to question the life planned out for her. Daniel was the opposite. He came from the streets, carried the scent of rebellion in his hair, and never asked for permission from anyone. With him, I felt alive, seen and cherished in a way I had never known. To love him was like standing too close to a bonfire. It could warm me, but it could also consume me whole. That night is seared into me. I had slipped away to meet him, and when a boy from a rival group cornered me behind the garages, I remember the panic clawing at my throat. Then Daniel appeared. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He lunged at the boy, a hawk protecting its own. I saw the glint of a knife, heard the sickening crack when Daniel twisted his arm, and then there was only silence. The boy never stood up again. Daniel was just 18. They called it excessive self-defense, but the law didn't bend for boys from broken neighborhoods. Within weeks, he was sentenced, and the man who had once carried me on his back down the empty streets of our town was marched into a prison yard. I was left outside the gates, clutching my secret, the tiny flicker of life inside me. Pregnancy was not supposed to happen to girls like me. My parents were quiet, careful people. My father worked as an accountant, my mother in a kindergarten classroom. Respectability was their currency, and I knew this news would destroy them. So I hid it. I bound myself in tight clothes, skipped meals, studied until dawn to distract my mind from the nausea that never came. When I left for college exams, I carried my growing secret, like contraband, beneath my heart. Through it all, I wrote to Daniel. My letters poured out every detail of my days, my fear, my determination, my longing for him. His replies came rarely, scrawled in pencil on lined paper. They were brief, almost childlike. Count the days until I'm home. Protect our baby. Live for us both. He never spoke of prison life, never let me glimpse the darkness he was living through. He wanted to shield me, even from behind bars. And then, one day, the letter stopped. I learned the truth, not from him, but from a fellow inmate who had known him. An accident, they said. He slipped in the prison bathhouse, struck his head on a bench, and never woke up. I never saw his body, never stood at his grave, never laid flowers on the soil that covered him. He was simply gone, swallowed by the system, erased from the world as though he had never been. I carried the wound like a hidden scar. My Daniel, the boy who once fought the world for me, had left me with nothing but a growing belly and the memory of his laughter. And though time marched on, though life demanded I keep moving, a part of me was buried with him that day. Those months after Daniel was taken from me blurred into a haze of exhaustion and secrecy. By day, I bent over my textbooks, forcing my mind to memorize English literature, foreign grammar rules, anything that would prove I still had a future. By night, I wrapped myself in layers of tight fabric, praying no one noticed the curve of my belly. Every mirror became my enemy. Every careless glance from a neighbor felt like accusation. I told myself I just had to make it through the entrance exams. If I could get into college, if I could slip away from home, then maybe I could keep my secret safe a little longer. Somehow I managed it. My grades carried me through the written tests, and when I arrived at the student dormitory for the oral exams, it felt like freedom. No parents to scold me, no neighbors to whisper. Just 3 bare walls, a narrow bed, and a desk covered in my notes. I thought I had bought myself time, but life doesn't wait. It was late one evening when the first sharp pain gripped me, sudden and merciless. I remember standing in the hallway, clutching my side, the floor spinning under my feet. A senior student happened to pass by, his eyes widening when he saw the spreading stain beneath me. "She's in labor," he shouted, and suddenly there were hands everywhere, dragging me down the corridor, shoving books into a bag, calling for an ambulance. I wanted to scream that it was too soon, that I wasn't ready, but the words stuck in my throat. The hospital they took me to wasn't the gleaming facility from television dramas. It was a crumbling building that smelled of bleach and stale soup, the kind of place that took in women like me, unwed, undocumented, unwanted. The walls were yellowed, the sheets rough, and the nurses barely glanced at me as they wheeled me down a dim corridor. They asked for papers I didn't have, for a family member I couldn't name. When I whispered, "There's no one," their faces tightened with practiced indifference. They placed me in a small ward with 2 beds. That was when I met her, Victoria Hayes. Even in the half-light, she was impossible to miss. Her hair, a thick golden mane tied carelessly back, framed a face that should have belonged on a magazine cover. But her eyes were hard, her posture careless, as if she had long stopped caring what anyone thought of her. When she smirked and introduced herself, it was with the kind of defiance I had never dared to own. She was everything I wasn't: wealthy, reckless, unafraid. A daughter of privilege sent here only because her pregnancy would embarrass her family. She told me so herself, her voice dripping with bitter amusement. They gave me a suitcase of cash and shoved me out the door, said to hide until the problem solved itself. She laughed at her own cruelty, but there was pain beneath it too. I, on the other hand, had nothing. No suitcase, no family blessing, not even a hand to hold. I lay there in that narrow bed, every contraction tearing through me, and realized I was more alone than I had ever been in my life. No mother stroking my hair, no father pacing the hall, no Daniel whispering that I could be strong. Just the hum of the failing fluorescent light, Victoria's sharp voice filling the silence, and my own fear pressing down on me like a stone. That night, as the storm inside my body grew stronger, I understood. Whatever child I brought into this world, I would have to face it alone. The night blurred into screams, sweat, and the raw tearing of pain. I had thought I was strong, that I could endure anything for the child inside me. But nothing prepares you for the reality of childbirth, least of all when you are 17, alone and terrified. When it was finally over, the room fell eerily quiet. I waited for the sound I had dreamed of for months, the sharp cry of my baby, but silence pressed against my ears. A nurse leaned over the small bundle, her expression grim. "He's not breathing," she murmured, and then everything around me collapsed. I remember begging, whispering through cracked lips, "Please, please, do something." But the nurse only shook her head. My baby boy, the child of my great love, was gone before he had even begun. They placed him in a cold bassinet at the far side of the room, and my heart split open. It was Victoria who broke the silence. She had delivered her son hours earlier, a pink, squirming boy who had wailed so loudly the entire ward must have heard. She leaned over her bed now, her golden hair a tangled mess, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "Look at you," she said, her voice low and cutting. "You don't even have papers. No family waiting outside. No one to fight for you." I wanted to tell her to stop, but I had no voice left. She studied me, then glanced at the lifeless form of my baby across the room. And then, with a strange calm, she made an offer that would haunt me forever. "Take mine," she whispered. At first, I thought I hadn't heard correctly. She repeated it, slower this time, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. "Take my baby. He's healthy, loud, stubborn already. You'll leave here with him, and I'll sign the papers. My family will never know. They'll believe he died like yours did." I shook my head violently, tears spilling down my cheeks. "That's madness. I can't. You can," she cut me off. "You should. You wanted a future for your son. Don't waste it. Mine will never have one with me. I don't want him." Her voice cracked on the last words, but her eyes remained defiant. She looked around the ward, her voice barely audible. "No one's watching. No one cares what happens here." I followed her gaze. The nurse on duty had barely glanced at us in hours. Paper files were stacked carelessly by the door. There were no name bracelets, no security checks, just fatigue and silence. It was as if this place existed outside the world. "If we do this," she whispered, "no one will stop us." A moment later, a nurse walked by. She saw us both, saw the two bassinets, and kept walking. Maybe she knew. Maybe she chose not to care. I would never know that I stared at her in disbelief. The very idea felt monstrous. My child, my Daniel's child, lay cold and still in a corner, while another breathed and cried just feet away. To switch them felt like a sin too heavy to survive. But the longer I looked at the tiny body that would never open its eyes, the more unbearable the thought of leaving empty-handed became. My chest heaved with guilt and longing. I pressed my fists into my eyes, whispering apologies to the boy I had lost, promising him that I would never forget him, never stop loving him. And then, with trembling hands, I reached for the child Victoria had brought into the world. His tiny fingers curled around mine, warm and alive. In that instant, something inside me broke and healed at the same time. Before dawn, under the indifferent gaze of weary nurses, Victoria and I quietly exchanged the bassinets. No one asked questions. No one noticed, or perhaps they chose not to. The paperwork was signed, and the newborn boy was recorded as mine. I signed the birth form with trembling hands. In every official record, he would be listed as mine. No trace of Victoria, no shadow of the truth. I named him Michael. For 20 years, I carried the secret like a stone chained to my heart. To the world, he was my son, and in every way that mattered, he was. I fed him, rocked him, taught him his first words, dried his tears, cheered at his triumphs. I loved him with a fierceness that defied bloodlines. But in the darkest hours of the night, I would remember the child who never drew breath, and the choice that bound me to a lie. And I wondered if he could ever forgive me. Life after Michael's birth became a blur of responsibilities. I was too young to be a mother, too broken to be a wife, yet life demanded both from me. It was during those fragile years that I met Thomas Whitaker. He was a firefighter, the kind of man people respected by default, tall, broad-shouldered, uniform crisp against his body, his presence steady and commanding. To a woman like me, scarred by grief and secrecy, his stability seemed like a promise. When he asked me to marry him, it wasn't with flowers or declarations of love. It was with the blunt assurance of a man who had weighed the facts and made a decision. "I won't ever love your boy like my own," he said one evening, his voice measured, almost clinical. "But I'll be there. I'll provide. I'll stand in the picture beside you." It was not the proposal a young woman dreams of. Yet I accepted, because what other choice did I have? I needed someone to steady the ground beneath my feet, someone to give Michael a semblance of family. I told myself that honesty was better than false hope, that perhaps over time, Thomas's heart might soften. But hearts do not change by will alone. Our marriage unfolded like a contract rather than a romance. We shared a home, meals, and the endless rhythm of daily chores. We tried for years to have a child together. We visited doctors, clinics, endured cold examinations, and whispered reassurances. "There's no reason you can't conceive," the specialists told us. But month after month, nothing came. The silence of empty cribs haunted me, while Thomas's patience thinned like smoke in the wind. In time, I discovered what I had dreaded but somehow expected. Thomas had built another life outside of ours. Another woman, another child, a second family running parallel to mine, as though ours were never enough. Strangely, I did not rage. My heart had been too numb for too long. Anger requires energy, and all my energy had gone into raising Michael. So I worked. I poured myself into tutoring, becoming the English instructor people whispered about in town, the one who could make children read Dickens in the original, the one who helped businessmen negotiate deals abroad. The money was never extravagant, but it was enough. Enough to buy Michael books, to send him on trips, to give him a childhood not marked by scarcity. As for Thomas, he remained a fixture more than a partner. We shared the same address, but not the same life. He never mistreated me outright, but neither did he care in the way a husband should. His affection was rationed, his words sparse, his presence shadowed by the knowledge that someone else held pieces of him I never could. 20 years passed this way. 2 decades of quiet endurance, of dinners eaten in silence, of birthdays marked by polite gestures instead of joy. To the outside world, we were stable, respectable. Inside, I felt like a guest in my own home, tethered by duty rather than devotion. And yet, through it all, there was Michael. His laughter filled the cracks in my heart, His achievements gave me reason to wake each morning. He was my redemption, my proof that love, no matter how complicated its origins, could endure. Looking back, I realize ours was never truly a marriage. It was a long negotiation, an arrangement stretched thin until it could stretch no longer. The courthouse in Rhinebeck was small, almost quaint compared to the grand halls I had seen in movies. But to me, it felt enormous, cavernous, as if its walls contained the weight of every broken promise. I walked through the doors alone. Michael had offered to come, but I shook my head. This wasn't his burden to carry. My son's life was just beginning. I would not drag him into the wreckage of mine. The courtroom was hushed, filled only with the shuffle of papers and the murmur of lawyers. I sat at one end of the table, hands clasped in my lap, while Thomas occupied the other side. He looked composed, as though this were a business negotiation and not the dismantling of 2 decades. His lawyer spoke first, laying out facts with the precision of a scalpel. Dates, signatures, assets. I had expected bitterness, of course. I had expected accusations, the usual chorus of blame that accompanies divorce. What I hadn't expected was the weapon Thomas had been keeping hidden all these years. The lawyer produced a deed, neat and official, stamped and notarized. The apartment where we had lived, the forum space where Michael had taken his first steps, where birthdays were celebrated and Christmas trees stood, did not belong to us at all. It had been purchased under Thomas's mother's name, not his own. Every corner, every wall I had scrubbed, every curtain I had sewn with my own hands, it was never mine. "You have no claim to the property," the lawyer said flatly. "It belongs to Mrs. Whitaker's mother. Upon dissolution of this marriage, Evelyn will have no legal right to remain there." The words struck harder than any blow. My vision blurred, my ears roared. That apartment wasn't just a roof. It was my history. It was where I had survived nights of doubt, where I had watched Michael grow, where I had held myself together through loneliness so profound it threatened to swallow me whole. And now, in the sterile air of the courtroom, it was snatched away with a line of legal text. I turned to Thomas, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of remorse. But he only met my gaze with cold detachment. "You'll have a month," he said. "Pack your things and leave. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder. The word stung, as if he hadn't already made every year a quiet battle, as if discarding me now was simply a matter of efficiency. The judge's gavel echoed like a coffin lid closing, and just like that, 20 years were reduced to nothing. No compensation, no apology, just emptiness. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to shout that I had given my youth, my labor, my loyalty, and that those things were worth more than deeds and contracts. But the words tangled in my throat. To argue with him would have been like shouting at a stone wall. He would not hear me. He had never heard me. So I stayed silent. But inside, something shifted. The despair that had nearly drowned me hardened into resolve. If I had nothing left to lose, then I could no longer live in fear. The truth I had buried for 20 years pressed against my ribs, demanding to be heard. As I walked out of the courthouse, the Hudson Valley sun harsh against my face, I felt the first stirring of a decision. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding. Perhaps it was time to face what I had run from since the night my son was born. The past had been locked away too long. Now, with everything taken from me, I had nothing left but the truth. It was almost a year before the divorce that fate placed Victoria Hayes back in my path. I hadn't seen her since that night in the hospital, when our lives had tangled together in a way neither of us could ever undo. I often wondered if I would recognize her after all these years. I did, though not because she resembled the radiant girl I had once met. She was sitting outside a small cafe in Rhinebeck, hunched in a chair, a scarf wrapped around her head though it was warm. Her once golden hair had thinned. Her cheekbones jutted sharply against pale skin. The proud tilt of her chin was still there, but it trembled now with weakness. I hesitated, unsure if I should approach. But then her eyes lifted, and in that instant she knew me. "Evelyn Whittaker," she said, her voice rasping but steady. "I thought I'd never see you again." We sat together at a corner table, the clink of dishes and the chatter of strangers surrounding us, as if the world had no idea of the secret we carried. For a long while, neither of us spoke about it. We talked of the weather, of the town, of meaningless things. Then she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I've been sick for years," she admitted. "Cancer. It doesn't forgive, no matter how much money you throw at it." She gave a bitter smile. "And my money is all I've had." She told me how, after the baby she carried was declared dead, her parents had given her everything she could ever want: houses, accounts, investments. Anything to cover the scandal, anything to bury the shame. They had washed her hands of responsibility with stacks of bills. "I let them," she said. "I took their money, their gifts, and I spent my life running from the truth." Her hand trembled as she reached for mine. "But you gave that boy a life. You raised him into someone my family never could have." I used to wonder if I made the right choice that night. But seeing Michael from a distance, yes, I've watched him, her voice broke, I know now. He became everything I could never have given him. Kind, brilliant, good. I swallowed hard, my throat aching. Hearing her speak of him, like that, stirred a pain and pride I couldn't name. Then she leaned back, gathering what strength she had left. "I've written a will," she said plainly. "The villa in Cyprus near the sea, it will be yours when I'm gone. And there's money too. Enough to give you peace, Evelyn. Enough to give him more of a future." I stared at her, stunned. "Why me?" "Because you were the mother," she whispered. "Paperwork doesn't matter. Blood doesn't matter. You did what I couldn't. You stayed. You loved him when I wouldn't." She took a shallow breath, her eyes glistening. "Don't argue with me. I'm leaving soon, and this is the only right thing left I can do." Tears blurred my vision. For years I had carried guilt, shame, fear. To hear her say those words felt like someone lifting a stone from my chest. Before we parted, she held my gaze one last time. "The decision we made, it was the right one. That boy, your boy, is proof. He grew into a man worth everything we lost." I walked away that day with my heart heavy, yet strangely lighter. I knew our paths would not cross again. And when the news came months later that Victoria Hayes had passed, I found myself whispering a prayer for her, for the girl she once was, and for the choice that bound us forever. When the call came from Victoria Hayes's lawyer, I already knew what it meant. News of her passing had spread quietly through town. A brief obituary in the paper, a life summarized in a few clipped lines. But her voice from that cafe a year before still echoed in my ears. And I knew she had not left without making arrangements. The lawyer arrived at my home carrying a leather briefcase and an air of practiced solemnity. We sat at the kitchen table. Michael had gone out for groceries, and the man unfolded documents with deliberate care. His words confirmed what Victoria herself had told me. The villa in Cyprus, the accounts, the investments. All of it now mine. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said, sliding the papers toward me. "Ms. Hayes insisted you inherit directly. No contest, no conditions." She was adamant. I nodded, numb. Wealth had never been my pursuit. Yet here it was, offered like a final confession. But the weight of the inheritance was not money. It was truth. The secret I had carried for 2 decades pressed heavier than ever. And I knew then I could not hide it any longer. That evening, Michael returned, his arms full of paper bags, his face flushed from the cold. He looked so much like Daniel in that moment, his dark hair falling into his eyes, the curve of his jaw that my breath caught. I waited until the groceries were unpacked before I asked him to sit with me. "There's something you need to know," I began. My voice shook. "Something I should have told you long ago." He frowned, concerned. "Mom, what's wrong?" I told him everything. From the night in the hospital, the stillborn child, the offer Victoria had made, to the moment I carried him out of that building as my own. Every word felt like tearing a bandage from a wound that had never healed. I expected him to recoil, to hate me for the lie, to see me as a thief of the life that should have been his. When I finished, silence filled the room. He stared at me, his eyes wide, his hands clenched in his lap. I braced myself for anger, for rejection. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own breath. Then, slowly, Michael stood. He crossed the small space between us and knelt at my side, his arms wrapped around me, strong and unshaking. His voice was low, steady, unbreakable. "You're still my mother," he said. "You've always been my mother. Blood doesn't change that. You raised me. You loved me. That's all that matters." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I held him, sobbing into his shoulder. For 20 years, I had feared this moment, certain that the truth would destroy us. Instead, it became our salvation. The chain I had carried so long fell away, leaving me trembling but free. I whispered apologies, promises, words I had rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times. He only shook his head. "You don't owe me an apology, Mom. You gave me a life. You gave me love. That's more than anyone could ask for." In that embrace, I felt something deeper than forgiveness. I felt release. The secret no longer gnawed at my soul. My son had chosen me, not by birth, but by love. And I realized that was stronger than any tie of blood. For the first time in 2 decades, I could breathe without guilt. I could look at my son without the shadow of a lie between us. And in his eyes I saw not loss, but the beginning of something new. The months after Victoria's passing moved like a tide, carrying me into a life I never thought I would know. Michael had grown into a man with dreams of his own, and soon enough those dreams included Emily Carter, the bright-eyed girl who had stood by him through his studies, through the chaos of our family unraveling, through every moment of doubt. Their wedding was small, but beautiful. The ceremony took place in a chapel just outside Rhinebeck, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. I watched Michael's hands tremble as he slid the ring onto Emily's finger, and I felt the fullness of every year I had raised him swell inside me. My son, who had once clutched my hand on his way to school, now stood as a husband, ready to build a life of his own. When Emily gave birth to their daughter months later, I held the baby in my arms and felt time collapse. Tiny fingers curled around mine, warm and insistent. I thought of the child I had lost in that dim hospital long ago, of the one I had taken in his place, and of the woman who had given me the chance to be a mother. Grief and joy mingled, but for the first time, joy outweighed the grief. By then, the lawyer had settled Victoria's affairs. Papers were signed, accounts transferred, and soon Michael and Emily and I were standing before the whitewashed villa in Cyprus. It was perched on a hill above the sea. Shutters painted a pale blue, the scent of salt and jasmine heavy in the air. I had never seen anything so beautiful. We moved in together, 3 generations under one roof. The villa became alive with sound. Michael's laughter, Emily humming as she cooked, the baby's cries at dawn. The echo of emptiness that had followed me through years of silence and lovelessness was gone. Thomas never appeared again. There were no phone calls, no demands, no trace of him in our lives. For so long, his presence had loomed over me like a shadow, but now that shadow had lifted. In his absence, I found not bitterness but freedom. He had taken enough from me. I refused to let him take more. I walked the gardens at dusk, barefoot on the stone path, the sea stretching endless before me. Sometimes I would pause and close my eyes, listening to the waves and the faint laughter of my granddaughter drifting through the open windows. It was then that I realized I had finally come home, no longer bound by secrets, no longer trapped in a marriage that suffocated me. I was free to live as myself. I was Evelyn Whitaker, mother, grandmother, woman, and for the first time in decades I felt strong. Life had not been gentle. It had carved deep scars, forced impossible choices, stolen loves I could never replace. But it had also given me Michael, and through him, Emily, and now a child whose laughter filled the air like bells. This was my new beginning, a chapter written not with fear or silence, but with love. And for once, I was ready to live it fully. The villa in Cyprus soon became more than a house. It became a sanctuary, a place where laughter stitched together the torn fabric of my past. Days spilled into one another, bright with the cries of my granddaughter, the gentle rhythm of waves, and evenings spent watching Michael and Emily build the family I had once feared my son would never know. It was in this season of renewal that I first met Samuel Green. He arrived one afternoon for private English lessons, a recommendation from a friend in town. When I opened the door, I nearly lost my breath. His face bore the marks of hardship, scars etched across his skin like the aftermath of fire. But his eyes were what stopped me. They carried the same unguarded light Daniel's had carried all those years ago, fierce, searching, alive. At first, I kept my composure, ushering him inside, setting books on the table as if he were just another student. But as lessons went on, as we stumbled through Shakespeare and American idioms, something deeper stirred. His laughter came easily, rough but warm. His questions betrayed a mind eager to grow, to rebuild itself despite whatever battles had left him marked. And slowly, against my will, the walls I had built began to soften. One evening, after class, he lingered at the doorway. "You look at me," he said quietly, "as if you've seen me before." I didn't deny it. "Your eyes remind me of someone I once loved." He nodded, as though he understood without needing details. And in that silence, I felt a thread pull taut between us, fragile yet undeniable. I didn't fall in love the way I had with Daniel, in a rush of recklessness and fire. With Samuel, it was different. It was slower, steadier, like the tide that rises unnoticed until suddenly it surrounds you. He didn't erase the pain of my past, but he didn't need to. He simply stood beside me, and somehow that was enough. Meanwhile, life in the villa unfolded like a dream I had never dared to imagine. Michael thrived in his work. Emily glowed with the calm confidence of motherhood, and their little girl toddled across the courtyard, her laughter ringing like bells. At family dinners, we crowded around the long wooden table, plates full, voices loud. For the first time, I felt surrounded not by absence, but by abundance. Sometimes I would catch Samuel watching us from the terrace, his eyes soft, his lips curved in a smile that seemed to ask if he might belong too. And when he finally joined us one evening, taking the empty chair beside me, my heart knew the answer. It struck me then how life had come full circle. I had lost Daniel, but in Samuel's eyes, I glimpsed the chance to love again, not by replacing the past, but by honoring it. I had carried secrets that nearly destroyed me, but now I was free to live openly without shame. As I tucked my granddaughter into bed one night, she clutched my hand and whispered, "Grandma, don't leave." I kissed her forehead and promised, "I'm not going anywhere." And for once, I believed it. I often think back to the girl I was at 17, the frightened child, alone in a hospital bed, convinced her life had ended before it began. If I could reach across time, I would tell her what I know now, that survival is only the beginning, that love can return in unexpected forms, and that family is not bound by blood, but by the courage to choose one another. At 40, I once thought my story was finished. But here, surrounded by love, by laughter, by the promise of a second chance, I understood the truth. Life was not ending. It was only just beginning.